Hello, everybody, and welcome to Skeptics in the Pub Online. My name is Dave, and I'm from Coventry Skeptics in the Pub. Coventry is just one of the many groups that decided at the beginning of the pandemic to come together and not let the virus kill off our access to skeptical events. So we set up this collaboration to bring you a weekly dose of reason and critical thinking. If you like what we're doing, then we'd appreciate a donation at sitp.online/donate. The mods will also post this link into the chat for you as well. We've also set up a Discord channel where you can socialise with fellow skeptics at any time, and you can find out how to join at sitp.online/contact. If you just want skeptical news, then my personal recommendation is The Skeptic, which is now managed by the Merseyside Skeptic Society and can be found at skeptic.org.uk. Now moving on to tonight, where we're having a talk, followed by a 15-minute break, and then a Q&A. If you want to ask a question of our speaker or to vote for your favourite question to be asked, then you can do this at sitp.online/ask. And again, the mods will post this throughout the show. After the Q&A, we will then launch our virtual pub on Zoom, which you're all invited to. Our speaker tonight is Marianna Spring. She's an award-winning specialist disinformation and social media reporter for the BBC News and World Service. Previously, she worked for BBC Newsnight and on the Guardian news desk, and makes frequent appearances on the BBC TV segments, including recently presenting on BBC Panorama about her investigation into anti-vaccine content. Recently, Marianna was named on the Forbes 30 Under 30 Europe list. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Marianna Spring.
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and to be invited to be here, which is great. And I've got a presentation, which I will start playing now. So this talk is about how to become an online conspiracy agony aunt, which is very much what I have become over the past year. As David explained, I am the BBC's first ever specialist disinformation and social media reporter. And contrary to what some of the people who send me abuse on social media think, that actually means that I investigate the real world impact of disinformation and conspiracy theories being shared on social media. And I first started my job just a couple of weeks before the pandemic with a view to covering the US election, which was a few months ahead of that. I just covered the UK election, investigating what was being shared in Facebook groups and the impact that was having. But little did we all know, a few weeks later, we were in lockdown and there was a total flurry of online misinformation. It began in quite an innocent way. There were lots of WhatsApps about tanks on the streets or suggested cures and ways of diagnosing coronavirus. But it became apparent quite quickly how harmful even these more innocent examples of misinformation could be. People were passing them on because they were anxious, they were worried, they wanted to help their friends and family. And that meant that they were spreading like wildfire. So I spent a lot of time investigating how they spread, where they spread from, and talking to people about how they could spot disinformation being passed around on social media. And in the context of a pandemic, that really mattered because bad information about, for instance, holding your breath to check if you had coronavirus could actually lead to someone doing that and not seeking help if they were ill, or going to the supermarket and doing other things when they actually were infected. So it felt like a very important time to start my role. And soon enough, a lot of the misinformation we were seeing about the pandemic evolved and snowballed into conspiracy theories. The 5G conspiracy theories were perhaps the most well-known or first well-known example of that, people suggesting falsely that 5G technology was somehow responsible or linked to the pandemic. But since then, we've seen that conspiracy movement grow online. And while we often think of conspiracy theories as quite innocent and harmless, they're usually used to explain things that have already happened. These have been happening in real time. And anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, like the suggestion that Bill Gates is going to microchip everyone in the world, or claims that vaccines are part of genocidal plots, suggestions that the pandemic just isn't real, that it's a hoax, that it's planned, they have been very, very harmful. And I've spent the year speaking to people whose lives have been impacted by these conspiracy theories, who have lost their lives or lost loved ones, whose relationships have been really destroyed and ruined in many ways by what's being shared. And also we've seen lots of examples of violence being inspired by online conspiracy theories, whether that was the 5G rumours leading to people attacking and verbally harassing telephone engineers, to what we saw happen at Capitol Hill in America in January, which was very much inspired by the QAnon conspiracy theory, and other online and far right movements that organise themselves online. QAnon, in case people don't know what it is this unfounded conspiracy theory that President Trump is waging a secret war against satanic paedophiles. So that's pretty much an upshot of my year. And so more recently, I've spent a lot of time investigating these online conspiracy movements. And one thing I find time and time again is that I am inundated with messages from people who have been affected by conspiracy theories. And it's hard to quantify how much of a problem this is. But everyone I talk to, who I explain my job to, or who gets in touch with me on social media, has an example of how online conspiracy theories have caused harm in their own lives. And that's really sad and it's really upsetting. And I hope that this talk will shed some light on how I think we can report on online disinformation, conspiracy theories, the impact that it has, and also how you might be able to talk to someone in your life or combat this kind of stuff in your every day, whether it's on social media and Facebook groups. I talk to a lot of people who do that, but also just anyone who you know who's been affected in this way. And anyone is welcome to reach out to me about their experiences. And I should start with the necessary caveat, which is that online conspiracy theories, disinformation are worlds apart from legitimate criticism of government, legitimate concerns, medical debates and political debates that are ongoing. But we often see how a committed minority of activists online, whether that's anti-vaccine activists or those who deliberately promote conspiracy theories, exploit those legitimate debates and concerns. They play on those fears. And that's why it can be so complex reporting on this sometimes, because you see a lot of real normal concerns mingled with outlandish conspiracy theories. There's not a clear divide, or as clear a divide as perhaps existed towards the beginning of the pandemic. So that's my introduction, and now I will get going. So I've already explained a bit about what I do. I report on and investigate the impact, the origins, the ecosystem of viral disinformation, conspiracy theories, abuse on social media, and that's for TV, radio, and online across the BBC, which is something I love doing because I get to speak to all kinds of different people. I do stuff for Newsround, I do stuff for Radio 4, I do stuff for the 6 and 10 o'clock news, for Panorama, and so on, which is brilliant because I think that this is an issue that affects people universally. And there's a bit of a misconception that younger people aren't affected by online conspiracies and disinformation, when actually I think they certainly are affected. With older generations, it can often mean that people are less used to using social media, and as a consequence, they might be more likely to share stuff. But actually, younger people are hyper exposed to what's being shared online, and the way they get their news and the sources they rely on and trust are quite different to often people who are older. And that can make a difference, particularly when it comes to online conspiracies and how they spread. And I'm part of a brilliant team at the BBC, which is our disinformation team, and it's made up of fact checkers at Reality Check, disinformation experts at BBC Monitoring, and then journalists who investigate all things dodgy, the dark underbelly of the internet for BBC Trending. And I think that multifaceted approach is really important. Fact checking is key, but I think fact checking on its own is not enough. And you also want to be able to tell the story and to really engage with the personal impact that a lot of online disinformation and conspiracies can have. And I think by doing that, in many ways, you weaponize what allows that bad information, those conspiracy theories, to go viral in the first place. And that's one of the reasons, one of the things that I always remember when I'm doing my reporting. I've written this for the Times, which was all about the first year of doing my job. And I went into quite a lot of detail about the anecdotes that I perhaps don't get to talk about on air. There are all kinds of behind the scenes stories, which I think tell you a lot about how online disinformation and conspiracy theories work, and why people spread them and how people are affected. And one of those anecdotes is the story of a man who started to spread a really harmful conspiracy theory about Sarah Everard following her death, and it was really quite distressing to see. It was the suggestion that wasn't even real, that the whole thing was made up. And when I shared it on Twitter, lots of people said, God, I can't believe anyone would ever do this. And I wanted to try and understand why this man had decided to share this. So I tracked him down. I found the first person to share this conspiracy theory, and I messaged him. And I ended up having a phone call of about 45 minutes with him. And during the call, it became apparent that he was very obsessed with online conspiracy theories, and he clearly had been for quite a significant period of time. He told me about how his family had been affected during the pandemic. He'd had loved ones who'd fallen very ill. And it became quite apparent to me that his way of coping with that was to say the pandemic's not real, this is all a plot, because he couldn't really bear the reality of the impact it had on him. And when I said to him, these conspiracy theories that you've said about Sarah Everard are really upsetting, they're really difficult and hard to understand for people who knew her or have been really affected by this story, and certainly for her family and loved ones. And by the end of that conversation, he was really sorry, and he said he didn't mean to upset anyone, and that wasn't his intention, and he regretted posting that conspiracy theory. And there are numerous anecdotes like this, which I think show you that everyone is human, and people share bad things online sometimes, and even when they meant to, when you actually talk to them about it, person to person in real life, or at least over the phone or on Zoom or on Skype, it does make a difference. And I think that means that although a lot of my reporting is perhaps not so hopeful in its nature, there is something hopeful about this, and ways of overcoming, I think, particularly how disinhibited people can feel when they're communicating on social media. Another one of the anecdotes which really stays with me was when I was doing the investigation for Panorama into the anti-vaccine movement, I did a protest in December in Brighton, and I was speaking to some of the people at that protest. It was a protest against COVID restrictions, but there are a number of anti-vaccine conspiracy theories being promoted there. And I spoke to a man who was holding a sign saying that that Bill Gates was trying to kill everyone with a vaccine. And I started to question him. I said, well, why does Bill Gates, why would Bill Gates want to do that? And how would this work? And it's one of the tips I've picked up in my time reporting on this, how actually questioning how a conspiracy theory would even be possible is one of the most effective ways of challenging it, because often the evidence or the lack of evidence to combat those conspiracy theories makes it very difficult to simply say, well, this isn't true because of X, Y, and Z. And when I was asking this man these questions, he just turned to me and said, look, you clearly think most people are good, and I think that the majority of people are bad. And I think that tells you a lot about why people believe these conspiracy theories. We often think it's about people being gullible. I often find it's actually the opposite. People are very curious. They really want to understand stuff, but they might be vulnerable in various ways. And the universal trait I often find is that people are deeply cynical, often because they have had very bad experiences, totally legitimate bad experiences. And a lot of what's being shared on social media exploits those bad experiences, exploits that cynicism, exploits their understandable criticism of those in power or government. And that's why they can spread so effectively. And so I think that's my first conspiracy agony aunt tip, particularly when it comes to speaking to the people who are spreading this stuff, trying to understand why they do it. And I think by understanding why they do it, we can better put our finger on how this whole ecosystem functions and works. And I like to think that people are actually much more normal and much nicer than they seem to be on social media, particularly in a lot of my mentions and inbox. Although I have to say the overwhelming number of people who get in touch with me are brilliant to talk to, and I love hearing from everyone who reads and listens to and watches the reporting that I do. But I tend to spend a lot of time focusing on the people affected, and I think that's one of the ways that you can avoid glorifying perhaps the role of people who deliberately spread conspiracy theories with bad intentions. That can be because they want to grow their online platforms. It can be because they want to make money. They want to sell certain products. It can be for a political reason. We see lots of political disinformation campaigns and bad actors who deliberately exploit that. QAnon is in its essence a political disinformation campaign looking to smear the opponents of President Trump or former President Trump. It can be quite complex trying to figure out why people do this. I think it's also worth making a distinction between the very small minority of people who do this on purpose, who deliberately exploit distrust, cynicism, vulnerability in different ways in order to promote these harmful conspiracy theories. there's the next layer of people who fall victim to that and go on to spread conspiracy theories, but they are in themselves often victims of this stuff too. But first and foremost, I spend a lot of time speaking to the victims who don't choose to be victims of online conspiracies. And some of them are pictured here. Sebastian Shemirani, who is at the bottom there, is the son of Kate Shemirani, who has grown a large online following during the pandemic, promoting a number of harmful conspiracy theories about 5G, about vaccines, about all kinds of things. And she refutes those claims. She thinks that anyone who criticizes her misunderstands what a conspiracy theorist is, or that it's a term used to slur people. Her son Sebastian was very, very worried about the impact that she was having, and also about the impact that her promotion of conspiracy theories was having on their relationship. And he reached out to me and I interviewed him all about this. And I think one thing it really highlighted was the very personal impact of these conspiracy theories and how upset he was that he felt he no longer could have a relationship with his mum, and also how concerned he was about the broader impacts she was having by telling people not to have the vaccine, by telling them that this is part of a hoax or a scam, or akin to what happened to the Nazis in Germany during the Second World War and the Holocaust. And he was very, very disturbed by those anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and others. And he was perhaps the person who triggered this deluge of messages from people who said, I'm so happy Sebastian spoke out. I really liked your report because I'm experiencing this in my life, and my mum or my dad or my cousin or my son might not have grown the same size following, but they certainly have fallen victim to this stuff, and it's having a really, really serious impact at home. And it's from that point really that I started to speak more to people who've been affected and to try and understand the solutions, or at least how it was having an impact on their lives. Pictured at the bottom there is Brian and his wife Erin. And this time last year, Brian and Erin read that COVID wasn't real, or it wasn't serious, that it was caused by 5G. And as a consequence, they decided to, that they didn't follow health guidance. And when they both fell ill, they didn't seek help as soon as they could. And they both had COVID-19 and they ended up in intensive care, both very, very unwell. Luckily, Brian pulled through, but really sadly, Erin remained in hospital for a good couple of months after that. And she later died of heart complications linked to having had coronavirus. And Brian spoke very powerfully of how he really regretted underestimating the pandemic because of posts he was seeing on Facebook and believing some of these online conspiracy theories. And that was perhaps one of the most poignant reminders of how much of an impact this can have on people's lives and how devastating its consequences can be. And I think by putting a human face on these stories, like I said, you're able to kind of weaponize what allows disinformation and conspiracy theories to spread in the first place. They're very emotive. They play on our emotions, our feelings, and often fact checking, as important as it is, can feel quite detached, quite sterile in some ways. It's not as personal. So being able to show the impact that this has, I think, is crucial in that agony aunt role that I've come to play in some sense. And I hope has at least in some ways shed light on or exposed the real world harm that can be caused by online conspiracy theories. Another thing that I think is crucial is to understand what it's like to come out of the online conspiracy rabbit hole. It's something I've heard from lots of experts, that they think if people are able to hear from those who used to believe anti-vaccine disinformation on social media or other conspiracy theories online and have now rejected those beliefs, it's one of the best ways of them reflecting on their own position and perhaps understanding that they too might have fallen victim or been conned or tricked by a lot of the people who deliberately spread this stuff on social media. Pictured there is Catherine. Catherine lives in the Isle of Wight with her family, but she used to be an ardent believer in online conspiracy theories, particularly about vaccines, but also more widely about health, even flat earth conspiracy theories. And for her, this didn't begin with social media. It began before social media. She actually grew up in an environment that was very anti-medicine, very anti-establishment, and she thinks that made her especially vulnerable to online conspiracy theories because she was legitimately distrustful of authority that she felt had not helped her. She didn't grow up with very much money, and as a consequence, was deeply cynical of government, and that sort of led her down this conspiracy rabbit hole. Then social media arrived, and a whole new world of anti-vaccine content was available to her, and she fell deeper and deeper down this rabbit hole. And the process of climbing out for her was quite a lengthy one, but it began with realizing that perhaps she was being conned or tricked by those people who were promoting conspiracy theories about vaccines and then going on to sell products or consultations or other things. And she began to notice this particularly on YouTube, but also on Facebook. And she decided to use that phrase that is commonly said by those who believe conspiracy theories: do your own research. She decided to really do her own research and do it properly. And she started to look into a lot of these conspiracy theories, and she realized that there were serious flaws in what was being said. And actually, the vast majority of, or the weight of scientific opinion was totally against them. It was there that her system started to unravel. And she spoke so powerfully, but I think especially about how no one should ever feel ashamed or silly for believing something, that a lot of this stuff online is very, very convincing, and that there's never a time that's too late to change your mind, to be even more cynical, to use that critical thinking to really help yourself reject conspiracy theories that might be causing harm to you, either in your personal life or on a wider scale, or even to yourself. And I think that's another bit of advice that's crucial. If you are able to show people how other people have rejected these views, they can better get to grips with the way out of this rabbit hole. And it's by no means an easy process. Something that I'm investigating at the moment is what happens to everyone who has been radicalized, and I think that's probably the right verb, radicalized by online conspiracies during the pandemic. What happens to the leaders of these online movements? Where do they turn their attention, and what impact does that have on those families and those people? When I interviewed Sebastian, he said something really poignant about how the pandemic will end, or at least it will become easier. Life will go back to normal, but the difficulty, the storm that rages on in his family as a consequence of online conspiracy theories will remain, and that damage will be very hard to repair. And I think that is the case for a lot of people who get in touch with me, who desperately want answers and to understand how to help loved ones. Another thing that I think is a key part of my role is investigating the tactics of those who deliberately spread falsehoods online, because I think by exposing those tactics, you can better help people understand, as Catherine said, how you're being tricked or conned in some way. Sometimes those tactics are entirely deliberate. Other times people can get caught up within those tactics. And a good example of that is the story of Patricia, who's pictured at the bottom there, in her red hat and hoop earrings. And Patricia is from Texas in the US, and a picture of her feet went viral after she shared them on a GoFundMe page. And her feet were covered in painful sores. She had a really, really bad skin reaction. She happened to have taken part in a vaccine trial just a few weeks before that, and she was unsure about what had caused this irritation, but she wasn't able to go to work. And family member made this GoFundMe page using the pictures to say, please can you help? Patricia can't fund her medical care. She had suggested that maybe it was linked to the vaccine trial, but it very quickly transpired that it actually had nothing to do with the trial. Her doctors confirmed that she received the placebo, and the time frame just didn't work, nor did the original kind of alleged diagnosis. But nonetheless, Patricia's story was used by committed anti-vaccine activists online to further this narrative that vaccines are harmful, that they're going to be used to deliberately kill people or hurt them in some way. Patricia was devastated. She was really upset that her story was being used in this way, but it was out of control and impossible to stop. It was spreading in all kinds of different languages, particularly in Romanian, in Polish, across Facebook, across Instagram. Facebook groups in particular were a place where it was thriving. It was also on Twitter. This is something that we're seeing happen a lot, and Patricia's story was emblematic of that. Specific cases of people who have died or come to some kind of harm after having had the vaccine, with no or little evidence that harm was in any way linked to the vaccine, then being used by anti-vaccine activists to fuel those narratives online. And obviously this is in the context of legitimate medical discussions and debates about blood clots, for example, or other side effects of vaccines. But we know that overwhelmingly the evidence suggests vaccines are safe and effective, and their benefit massively outweighs the risk of contracting coronavirus. That's according to absolutely loads of scientists and experts, but that doesn't stop these really emotive cases being used. There was a Facebook group I recently investigated that was a bit like this. It was dedicated to the victims and families of those who'd received the COVID vaccine, and it was full of really emotive stories, 10, 20 every day of people talking about, maybe slightly less than that, but people talking about loved ones who had died after having the vaccine. I had no doubt that some of the stories were true, that people had absolutely lost their relatives, but trying to prove whether or not they were linked to the vaccine is a whole nother question. And the numbers did not fit with any of the scientific data or otherwise about the vaccine. Then there were also committed anti-vaccine activists who were clearly fabricating stories, and Facebook actually decided to take that group down, which is again quite interesting when it comes to the nuance of their harmful disinformation policy. In this case, they decided that seemingly there was enough harmful content to take that group down, but it does show you how effective it can be to use personal stories, images, a real person rather than numbers to spread disinformation. So I think by reporting on it, by focusing again on single stories, is a really effective thing to do, and being able to investigate those stories. This was a really, really hard one to get to the bottom of. I added over 100 people on Facebook for Patricia because she got rid of her social media profiles or changed their names. I had to speak to her doctor. She shared her medical records with me because there's lots of complex data regulations, legislation, and everything else, patient confidentiality and so on. So it can be really, really difficult to investigate those cases, and that's certainly a challenge that me and my team have come up against. More recently, I investigated the tactics of anti-vaccine activists here in the UK for Panorama, and I looked at one video in particular where a number of people brandished their medical credentials or scientific expertise, and then some of them went on to promote harmful conspiracy theories about the vaccine. For instance, the suggestion that it could change your DNA in some way. And a lovely woman called Rosemary in her 80s who lives in Norwich emailed me to say, I've seen this really scary video on WhatsApp. It's really freaked me out. I don't know if I want to have my vaccine anymore. And she was very much the starting point for my investigation. And I think that's part of this conspiracy agony role that I very much find myself following up on the stories of the people who get in touch with me. And that feels really important. That feels very much part of the public service remit of my job and the BBC more widely. And I find that, Rosemary went and interviewed her. This video had been flagged by a number of councils. A number of other people got in touch with me about it, how it had scared them off the jab. And being able to expose and investigate the tactics being used and also the harm that was caused was really important. And I went with Rosemary and her husband Donald when they had their vaccine and filmed them having it. And they were very excited, very happy to receive their vaccine. And it was brilliant to be able to see, not just to expose the real world harm caused, but to see the positive consequence of my reporting and the work that our team does. And I think that if you're able to say to people, look, this is how this works, and this is how people are tricking you or conning you, that's certainly a very effective way of reporting on this topic. Another thing I think is really helpful, good, is to actually track how bad information goes viral, how it spreads. This story on the left that I did, or maybe it's on your right, I think it's on the left, that I did about how bad information goes viral, focused on how one particular post, which people might have seen, it was about someone's uncle who worked at a university in Wuhan, and it snowballed and evolved, acquiring more and more bad information. Some of the information in it was good or benign, it wouldn't cause any difficulty, telling you to wash your hands, which is decent advice when there's a pandemic, but then there were other harmful claims about different cures for coronavirus and diagnosis, which actually could again lead people to misdiagnose themselves with not having coronavirus. And I tracked that post with my colleague Olga, and we looked at how it spread from some Facebook groups dedicated to people who are members of the Catholic religion in India. And then it jumped over to Ghana. It made its way here to the UK. It was being shared in the US. And it went particularly viral because a man in his 80s in Buckinghamshire called Peter shared it on his Facebook account. And he got lots and lots of likes. And I interviewed him about it at the time. And I said, why have you shared this? Because there's lots of inaccurate or false information in this post. It might be doing more harm than good. And he clearly just really liked getting likes on Facebook. And I think that tells us a bit about the people that inadvertently become coronavirus super spreaders. And I interviewed him at the end of the year about whether he'd learned from that experience, and he still was really enjoying posting on Facebook, and believing other kinds of conspiracy theories, which I think again tells us a little bit about the motivations of those who spread this stuff. More recently, I did a story that investigated the roots of the Stop the Steal voter fraud strategy. Stop the Steal went really viral in the days after the US election. There were huge Facebook groups that popped up, littered with disinformation about voting, videos of ballots being burned, ballots being ripped, people claiming they'd ripped up and thrown ballots out. And all of these conspiracy theories are not true. And these videos were quite easy to investigate and debunk, and my team did that. But nonetheless, these Facebook groups were full of them, as well as people threatening violence, which, in light of then what happened on the 6th of January, seems pretty poignant and pretty stark. And what I did with, again, working collaboratively with my team, was track back how how Stop the Steal, and that phrase, which was coined long before this US election, was being promoted on President Trump's, at the time, President Trump's Twitter, and how certain people were then amplifying claims about mail-in ballots or fraudulent voting, and how that then spread within Facebook groups and was capitalized, or was exploited by those promoting other conspiracy theories. QAnon in particular, we focus a lot on how QAnon is about satanic paedophiles and people suggesting people are eating babies, because it is the kind of really out there section of it. But actually, at its heart, QAnon is the belief that everything is rigged or set up to make, in this case, Donald Trump fail. And it's that belief that everything is rigged that in many ways made the ground so fertile for Stop the Steal to spring up, and then what we saw happen on the 6th of January. And it tells you a lot about how this ecosystem works and people who play a role in promoting harmful disinformation, who have very, very big followings, and how people then go on to further spread those claims. And I think, again, being able to take the audience with you, whether that's your viewers, your listeners, your readers, or just more broadly someone you know, being able to show them how something works, I think it not only increases trust in the media and understanding of how we do our jobs, but more broadly is a really good way of exposing to someone, look, this doesn't really make any sense. Let me show you, how this spread or what happened and how it works. I was once in a cab with a very lovely taxi driver, and he was telling me how he'd seen stuff about QAnon on social media, and I explained this to him. I explained where it had come from, how it worked, how it was spread, and everything to do with Stop the Steal and what was going on. And by the end of the conversation, he said, "Oh, yeah, no, I'm not sure about this QAnon thing anymore," when he was pretty set on it when I'd first got in the cab. Again, these kinds of conspiracy theories do play on legitimate concerns about people abusing power, about people who do bad things. And there are certainly people in the world who do very bad things. And as journalists, it's my job above all to investigate that. But in these cases, they often exploit those in order to spread harmful conspiracy theories. And that is a problem. Another thing I spend a lot of time doing is investigating trolling and online abuse. And a bit like the anecdote about the case of the man who invented that really awful Sarah Everard conspiracy theory that I mentioned at the beginning, I often think finding someone who's trolling or sending abuse, and being able to speak to them and communicate with them is good. There's this mantra, don't feed the trolls. And I think that broadly that is useful in so much as engaging on an individual basis would not only be impossible, especially for someone like me who receives quite a lot of abuse, but too tiring and too difficult, and it wouldn't necessarily help. But actually being able to, as a reporter, investigate who's sending this abuse and why they're sending it is something really important and effective that we can do. And I frequently hear from people who are experiencing online abuse, who receive death threats. Most recently, I've had a lot of medics, nurses, people who work in hospitals getting in touch with me about abuse they receive from people who think COVID is a hoax or that vaccines are part of a plot. And some of that abuse is really, really scary for them, threats, really horrific stuff, and they want to understand why people send this to them, and also what they can do to protect themselves. And actually, a bit of a plug, but there's an article I've written which should be in the I newspaper tomorrow, if you want to go and buy it or read it online, all about this, and about this don't feed the trolls attitude and how helpful it is. But I'll talk about that in a second. These two stories that are featured were ones I did about trolling. And again, I chose to focus on those impacted. At the bottom there is Momo. Momo was a peaceful anti-racism protester who attended marches in London following the murder of George Floyd. He was targeted with horrific abuse online, particularly from far-right groups, after false claims that he tried to set fire to the cenotaph flag when the Union flag at the cenotaph went viral. And he was quite clearly not the person who tried to do that. They were wearing a similar coat, but otherwise they were a different gender, a different build, not the same person. But nonetheless, he was horrifically targeted. And he was very disappointed that social media sites had not acted to remove not only the false information, but some of the abuse as well. He spoke very powerfully about the impact that it had on him, but also revealed a lot about how this ecosystem works and how disinformation can be used as a tool to troll people, to abuse people. And I think understanding the very dark side of often these online conspiracy movements and the really horrible and unkind things people can say is another really useful way of highlighting or emphasizing to people what these movements are and what they seek to do. And I think that interviewing Momo was a really important thing, particularly in light of what we're now seeing, social media boycotts from the big football organisations and other sporting organisations over racist abuse. It's been highlighted again and again by a number of footballers as a serious problem they face. And Momo faced it again on a very personal level as someone who, unlike me, for instance, at work, who has editors and security teams who give me advice, didn't have any advice on what he should do, was trying to report stuff desperately to social media sites, felt like nothing was happening. And so it was important to report on his story. Political activist Gina Miller also took part in a report that I did. In this case, she agreed to meet her troll, who is a man called Alan. And he'd sent her death threats, racist abuse, and misogynistic abuse on Brexit-themed Facebook groups. Some of the stuff was really, really horrible. And I went and interviewed him, and he was pretty set on what he'd said, that he agreed with what he said, and admitted he was feeling sort of pretty passionate politically at the time that he sent those messages. Then I got him to meet Gina, and they had the most touching conversation where they realized they had so much in common. They both had really similar life experiences. They both had to sleep in their cars before. They'd both experienced really difficult things in their life, which they bonded over. And he really sincerely apologized to Gina Miller for the abuse he'd sent. And I believe they're still in contact now. Alan's still in contact with me. He was one of the first people to wish me a happy birthday. And he speaks quite vocally against trolling now, having realised the effect of what he was doing. And he was very much emblematic of how disinhibited people can become online. Also someone who was having a really difficult time in his personal life. And how trolling was an outlet for that. And he very much recognised that afterwards. And that was a really important report, and one I'm really proud and happy that I did. But trolling is also something that I experience very much in my own life. In fact, it's something I experienced a lot over the weekend. And there are plenty of people who think that I'm not the specialist disinformation reporter, who said I am a psyop or a spy or every horrible word under the sun that you can think of. I try and report from a point of empathy, although there is a limit sometimes when you're receiving really horrible death threats and abuse, and it's often very coordinated. And I find myself very much in the ecosystem that I'm reporting on, and part of trying to intimidate reporters into no longer investigating that ecosystem is to send them horrible abuse. A lot of that comes about because you are treading this. You are having to be very careful about distinguishing the difference between extreme online conspiracies and legitimate concerns people can have, but sadly the two frequently interact, and there are a number of bad actors that exploit that, and so exposing those disinformation ecosystems, reporting on them, reporting on their impact is something that has resulted in me receiving a lot of abuse. And in the piece that I've written, this was something I wrote for the Eye before Christmas, in the piece that I've written coming out tomorrow, I talk a lot about this mantra, don't feed the trolls, and new research that the UN has done that suggests that one difficulty is that if we talk about trolling and we talk about online abuse, we risk fueling more abuse. But at the same time, for change to happen, and I'm obviously not a campaigner, I'm an investigative reporter, and my job is not to campaign, but nonetheless, reporting or holding these certain social media sites or governments or otherwise, or those who deliberately troll people accountable for for what's going on when it comes to online abuse is a crucial part of my job. And so it's fascinating to try and understand how the societal approach to trolling may or may not be the right one. And like I said, there's a boycott of social media by some of the by footballers and footballing organisations, also a number of other sporting organisations over the weekend, because in their eyes they feel as though social media sites are not doing enough, and so that's part of my wider remit, and I guess it doesn't so much fit in under the bracket of being the BBC's conspiracy agony aunt, because I also am a bit like the BBC's trolling agony aunt, but perhaps that's something I can do quite well, because I know what it's like. I know what it's like to experience that abuse, and I hope that some of my personal experience in speaking out about that in some ways helps a lot of the people who send me messages asking me questions, asking me about how I cope with that level of abuse and telling me their own experiences. And that's one of the most valuable parts of my job, the people who get in touch with me and tell me their experiences, whether it's of trolling or online conspiracy theories, because it often reveals to me the scale of this problem, and it allows me to tell really important human stories, to humanise the impact that this is all having, and to expose the bad stuff going on, and how it affects people. And so yeah, I think that's sort of the upsum of everything I do. And to conclude, really, I guess that it is the greatest privilege in the world to be this online conspiracy agony aunt. It's brilliant, but it comes at a cost, and a cost that I'm more than happy to pay, and I'm very lucky to have a brilliant team around me. But I think in your own life, if you know someone who's been impacted in this way, who's been impacted by online conspiracy theories, who's fallen victim to them, I think that the best things that you can do, particularly if you're someone that they trust, is talk to them, engage to them, arrive from a point of empathy. Don't just think it's about people being stupid or silly or bonkers, because that's definitely not always the case. Try and get to the bottom of the legitimate concern that's often led them down that path. Try and encourage them to really do their own research, to really think critically. Try and expose to them why people do this and how they might be being tricked or conned by bad actors online, and also the other horrible things that happen in this ecosystem, so they're really aware of how it works. And hopefully maybe one person will find some of that advice useful and go on to use it in their real lives. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much for that, Marianna. That was absolutely fascinating, giving us a lot to think about during the break. We're now taking a 15-minute break, so you can all recharge your glasses. There is also, if we've got the opportunity still to ask questions and vote for the questions that you want to hear answered at sitp.online/ask. Also, during the break, it gives you an opportunity to check out the Skeptic Discord, our merch store, or make a donation through PayPal. Next week, we have Alex Vitale, who is talking about the end of policing and introduction to the concepts of police defunding and police abolition. He has a book out, which is available right now for free, and the mod will post a link into the chat where you can get it. We will be back at 8 o'clock with the Q&A with Marianna. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Going to go into the Q&A now with Marianna Spring. So I think we will start off with the generic question that we have every single week, which is, do you have a cat or dog, and can we see it?
Yes, and yes. My Mia is here on hand. Here's one I made earlier. I didn't make her earlier, though. She's very cute. She's 16 years. She's just had her 16th birthday. She also has 6 little toes on her. She's like a witch cat.
She's so cute, and I can't see the Twitter chat right now, but I can only imagine what's going on in there. I can imagine the word cat has been said at least 30 times, but what a beautiful cat. Right, we'll go on to...
Her down to sleep beside me.
We'll go on to some of the more sensiblish questions that we've been asked. So the first question we've got is from Paul, aka Picticule, who asks, what proportion of conspiracy theorists spread their theories because they really believe them, compared to those who spread them for other reasons?
I think that's a really good question, because it's very, very hard to confirm or at least definitively prove the intention. I think that actually there's quite a large group of people that spread conspiracies because they genuinely believe them, and they often believe quite a kind of hodgepodge of different beliefs, as in they're not they don't believe everything. Like they might believe the Bill Gates microchip stuff, but they don't believe the pandemic is a hoax, or they might believe, although you do tend to find stuff goes hand in hand, and a lot of people who get in touch with me say, oh, my cousin, auntie, mum, dad started thinking that it wasn't real, then they became anti-vax, and now they think that Hillary Clinton eats babies in a basement as a la QAnon. So that is, but I think that the people who deliberately spread this are actually quite a committed minority, but a powerful minority who grow quite big followings and are repeat offenders who deliberately spread conspiracies. So I do think there are people who are genuine believers, and those are the people that I guess with my conspiracy agony aunt hat on you can help in some way, although it can be quite complex and quite difficult. Whereas people who are spreading this on purpose for various other gains, usually kind of political power, money kind of reasons, they are not going to come down unless they see it beneficial to them personally.
Yeah. It's really hard to tell. The way to know for most people, and I'm thinking back to my experience of looking at psychics, there are some people who genuinely believe they're psychic. And then there are people who have information fed into their ears and very clearly know they're not. But there's no way to know which ones are which until you catch them out.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the problems is that the people who spread this stuff on purpose for bad reasons are not going to admit to you that they spread it on purpose for bad reasons. So if you can find those bad reasons, or at least circumstantially present to them, well, you do this, but then you also try and sell this or push this, or you're using this to kind of build a political platform, then you can expose intent in that way. But otherwise it can be quite hard to tell the difference. I think when someone has a big social media following, you definitely have to ask more of those questions. I think if someone called Bob has got about 6 followers, you can bet that they're not trying to sell things or grow a profile.
So moving on to a question from Andy Merritt. How much does the way the media wants to set up two sides, even when one side is wrong, e.g. anti-vaxxers, etc., to give legitimacy to conspiracy theorists?
I think that's, again, a really, really good question. And I think that, I hope that the fact that I even exist shows that the media is making a concerted effort not to do that anymore, that there are things that are true and false, and there are things that are opinion. And I spend a lot of my time trying to explain that to people because, it is just categorically not true that, you're going to get microchipped by the vaccine. There's just nothing to suggest that's the case. And so we don't need to put someone on air who's going to disagree and say, oh, maybe there is. Our job is to investigate it and to ascertain whether it's true or false, and then to report on that. And so I think that it's something that the media has been guilty of, but is much better at not doing or avoiding doing now. That kind of, the classic example is the climate change one. But I think for that reason, it's why I also focus on the victims of this stuff, the people whose lives are impacted, because again, one big editorial concern we have a lot of the time is about amplification and giving undue prominence to the people that deliberately spread this stuff and to the false beliefs. So we have a bar that if something has gone so viral, or a lot of people have got in touch with me about something, good example being the video I investigated for Panorama, then it's in the public interest for us to investigate it and expose it and get to the bottom of it. But if it was something that wasn't really viral or wasn't really being shared, we also, or hadn't caused harm, because I think if you can prove that something has caused harm, whether it's, scared someone off the jab with incorrect information, or whether it's resulted in someone coming to harm in their personal life, then that justifies, again, investigating it in a way that if it's just kind of a post that's not really picking up steam and hasn't affected anyone too much, it's not worth our time. Similarly, a lot of the people that spread this stuff on purpose want you to pay a lot of attention to them. That's kind of the point. And so you don't want to unnecessarily amplify what they're doing either and who they are. And it's for that reason that focusing on, the people who are affected can be good.
I think it was something that was a massive issue a few years ago, the whole false balance of, we've got somebody talking about climate change, we need to have an anti-climate change. But actually it was giving a false balance and giving them equal amounts of airtime. And it's like, well, actually, no. One is believed by a fringe minority, and then there's the evidence and the scientists and everything else. And it's like, why are we giving them so much time when actually it's all disproven?
Absolutely. And I think actually in some ways I think that the media's attitude to it has improved, but it's got worse because social media is so polarized. everyone sees everything as sort of an opinion debate, a political debate all the time, even when it's actually like, well, no, this is just like demonstrably untrue, and we can prove it's untrue. And our job as reporters and journalists is to report on facts and what's true. That's kind of the point. So yeah, I think it's something that I'm really pleased that, particularly at the BBC, like the fact that me and my team exist means that it's something being taken very seriously. And in fact, we have an impartiality course at the BBC, which all kinds of journalists go on, and that's one of the examples given. You know, if you're reporting on demonstrably false allegations about the vaccine, say, you don't need to balance it in that way. Yeah. But you can add, as I did at the beginning, that there are legitimate medical debates and concerns and questions people might have, and that's really different to those extreme conspiracy theories, but it can leave you vulnerable to them, and that's always important to get across as well.
Absolutely. I think this leads very nicely into, we've got a few questions that are all kind of linked to in a way. So, Anonymous asks, why is there so much distrust of the BBC? When I point out information on BBC or on Sounds, I often get the response, well, you can't trust the BBC.
Yes, that is something that I get in a lot of my more abusive messages, people who really, really don't like the BBC, and people will bring up legitimate, very bad things that have happened. What happened with Jimmy Savile being one example of that. But what I always like to point out is that all of the reporters, journalists, people I work with are some of the best journalists I've ever met. They are brilliant. They work tirelessly to report on stories, to do their best to investigate them, to get to the bottom of them. And I sometimes wish that people could see the sort of inner workings more of how the BBC works and the brilliant people who are part of it. And you know, in any big organisation, I mean, in the case of the Jimmy Savile scandal, bad things can happen and things go wrong, but that doesn't mean that the journalism should be distrusted in any way. And yeah, I mean, if people saw, I spend a lot of my time going into the office because I have to do stuff for broadcast, and how hard people work and how much they sacrifice and how much they want to tell people stories and do their jobs is really brilliant. And I think that distrust is a product of a changing media landscape, that people use social media for information, and perhaps that's dented some trust in the institutions or places they might have turned to before. You know, they're not switching on the telly to watch the news in the same way, and that makes a difference. I think that there are also a number of bad actors, of people who deliberately target the BBC for political gain, and that's definitely played a role as well. So it breaks my heart that people don't trust the BBC, but I think that if you, on an individual level, could see what a lot of the journalists and reporters do, then it would increase that trust. And it's for that reason that I like to kind of show the anatomy or investigate how something spreads, to really try and take the audience along with you. And even doing talks like this, being able to explain to people about what I do and how my job works, I think are really, really good, because then you're not just this kind of face that pops up on the telly or does something else. You're actually a person. People can better understand how your job works.
So the thing that really frustrates me with, especially like the Jimmy Savile thing, is it's just poisoning the well. You're using that argument to say you can't believe anything that the BBC does. It's like, well, no, you can't just generically say because of one bad actor, an entire organisation is corrupt. That's not how it works. And especially when each of the people there are individuals, they do their own reporting, you know, their own investigation. It's not as if they're just towing the BBC line and going, this is what you're going to broadcast. They do their own work.
Absolutely, and I think one thing I get a lot is, I make it sound like I get loads of abuse, which I do. I do get overwhelmingly positive messages, but amongst the abuse, I do frequently get, well, you're a puppet and people are telling you what to think, and I just find it so hilarious because absolutely no one's telling me what to think. I have a brilliant editor who encourages kind of particularly sort of investigating the impact of online conspiracies and humanising its impact, and I've never once had a story pulled or been told what to write, or like, that's just never happened.
That's great.
But people don't believe you if you say that. People are, you know, and the only time stories are ever delayed or pulled is often usually just because the news agenda is really, really busy, and it will be like, oh, actually, there's this really big story that's happened. We'll run our story on a different day, etc. So, yeah, I think if people better understand how journalism works, and that's not to say that there aren't bad things that happen. You know, there are bad things that happen in all industries. But just my personal experience is certainly not that case at all. And I work with some of the best people I've ever worked with. So I always feel sad that people are like, no, you guys are evil. Like, what?
And I mean, we as skeptics get it ourselves, because every time we share something about how great the vaccine is, or, you know, the positive sides of things, oh, you're just a shill for Big Pharma. you're paid by Big Pharma to say this. It's like, well, if I did, I would be living in a much nicer house, and I wouldn't be. It's like, come on, be realistic. Are Big Pharma paying every single one of us skeptics to stand out here and go, yeah, vaccine good?
And I think on that point of distrust, actually, as well, I mean, I think some people who are distrustful of the BBC feel as though it doesn't represent them anymore, or that it doesn't tell their stories and stuff that affects their lives. And I think that does play a role. And it's quite hard in a kind of ever partisan media landscape, because the BBC is not, it's impartial. And that means that it's appealing to a broad section of people, but it's not got those polarized news stories in the way that ones in other publications do. And people find that hard because they want to kind of identify with stuff, and that's the way social media works, really, sort of like find your tribe and you stick to it. And the BBC isn't like that in the same way. But something that a lot of BBC bosses have been vocal about very recently is, how the BBC endeavours to best represent and tell the stories of all kinds of different people from all kinds of different communities. And it's for that reason that I love reporting on and investigating the stories that are sent to me by people who listen and watch and read, because that's the point. They're the reason that we're here. So that feels crucial as well in sort of overcoming that distrust.
So moving on slightly from this, Rusbits asks, there's a lot of vocal distrust of the BBC expressed in social media. How much of this is a conspiracy? So is it manufactured to try and steer away from the correct information, or not?
I think that it's often used by people who deliberately spread conspiracy theories or disinformation online. They want to undermine those news sources. And that's not just the BBC, it's broadly the media, which is often referred to as the MSM, the mainstream media. It's a bid to undermine and tar that accurate reporting, and it can be very effective, because when you make people question their sources, it's like what I was saying, actually, to help people out of the conspiracy rabbit hole, you want to expose and shed light on the wrongdoing or the bad stuff that the people they're trusting are doing. They do the exact same the other way around, and so that definitely is part of that conversation. There are people who express criticism of the BBC because they genuinely are upset with something the BBC's covered or the way they've covered it, and that's totally legitimate. And the BBC does a lot of output, which means there's a lot of stuff, which means there's a lot of room for people to make mistakes very easily, accidentally. And that's very different to a conspiracy. But I do think that a lot of the people who I investigate and report on deliberately use that in a bid to undermine our reporting. I mean, same with the disinformation they spread about me being some kind of psyop. It's just a bid to undermine what I'm saying and to stop me doing my job, really, which it won't.
See, the other problem I see that the BBC has is because they're trying to be impartial, they lose the people on the left, the people on the right, because they're trying to stay as central, and it doesn't necessarily represent them because it can't represent them, because it's all about trying to be impartial. We've got a question here from Grimbeard. I love this question. So what you're doing is great, but shouldn't all journalists be anti-disinformation specialists? Does journalism need to clean its act up?
I think this is a good question. Broadly, all journalists' job is to report on facts and to dispel mistruths. That's at the base of what journalists do. They hold institutions, they hold people accountable, they report on wrongdoing, stuff that's going badly, they report on the news, what's happening, and I think absolutely that is core. I guess what separates my job specifically from the broader remit of all journalists is that I investigate online disinformation and conspiracy theories and how it spreads on social media. And that's quite a niche, or it felt like quite a niche beat. I don't think it's actually that niche anymore. It's something that a lot of journalists in the US have been doing since the 2016 election, especially, and allegations of foreign interference and all of that kind of stuff. And that was when Pizzagate and QAnon was born as well. So there are brilliant journalists at NBC and at BuzzFeed and at the New York Times and other places that cover this beat specifically. So I think that while it's absolutely crucial that, yes, every journalist reports accurately, and in fact, it makes my job so much easier and better if people do report well and they report accurately, and that really evidence-based reporting is out there in the public domain, because the media similarly can play a role in this sort of disinformation ecosystem and kind of fueling or being used to fuel conspiracy theories. But I think what I specifically do is investigating the impact of what's being shared on social media and the victims of that, and exposing the tactics being used. And that's quite specific to my role, I guess. But a very valid point, and I hope all journalists do excellent, well evidence reporting, because maybe then I don't need to exist.
The thing is, I think that also some of what you does it makes our lives a lot easier, because instead of having to go and trawl through all of this information, you've already done it for us. You've written a nicely presented article for us that we just need to read rather than having to do. And yes, we should still do our primary evidence and looking at what's going on. But when you've got a journalist that specifically specializes in misinformation and looking for that misinformation, it gives you at least a starting point where you can start and look and then read further if you want to.
Yeah, definitely. And my colleagues at Reality Check, who are absolute fact checkers extraordinaire, do this all the time, and they go through like the amount of. They'll go through entire speech. They'll go through everything. They'll fact check what politicians say. They'll fact check, and that is such a valuable resource. I mean, I find it really helpful because my reporting in many ways complements that, and the great fact checks that they have. And there are loads of organisations as well, Full Fact, First Draft, other places that do great work like this. And I think it's hugely valuable. And the best bit is they often link to or quote all kinds of different specialists and experts. So you've got all that information in one place, and you can look into it more if you want. But it's easily digestible, and that's a very good thing.
The thing is, a lot of these rabbit holes are not easily digestible. Once you start going down, there are so many thousands of offshoots.
I was interviewing someone who believed conspiracy theories before Christmas, and honestly, his belief system was so complicated. I had to keep going over it. I'd be like, right, so you think this, and the problem is that so much conflicts. You'll say, well, I don't really understand. You think the pandemic isn't real, but you also think that vaccines cause coronavirus. It's like, it doesn't really make sense because you think coronavirus doesn't exist. And they're like, no, you've misunderstood.
Reminds me of the Flat Earth movement, and Michael Marshall, one of our organisers, went to the Flat Earth convention, and he came away just going, well, yes, I've learnt a lot. I've also learnt that basically none of them agree with any of each other. They just all have their own points of view on this thing, and they're like, none of it agreed with the other ones. It was just 15 separate points of view, but they all came around this thing of we're flat earthers. It's like, well, you are, but you're all completely different. You don't believe the same things.
Yeah, exactly that.
We've got Craig Sheffield. I assume that's Craig from Sheffield, but it might be Craig Sheffield. How do you rebuild trust when the government itself has often misrepresented their own data and have been pulled up in Parliament by their own MPs?
So I think that in many ways that's sort of the question for the government. I guess my job isn't to build trust in government. My job is to very much, investigate, again, disinformation being shared by the government. But I guess that's more the job of my colleagues at Reality Check fact check everything from what's being shared online to what's being shared offline. And what we tend to find is that stuff that the government says can be reappropriated, misappropriated, or it can, that disinformation or comments that are said in a certain way can then be used on social media to fuel other narratives. But it's the job of my colleagues at BBC Politics and my Reality Check colleagues to sort of fact check what's said in speeches and what people say. And I think to the point that you make, Craig, that actually distrust is key in why conspiracy theories spread so much. And a lot of people's opposition to the government, opposition to the way that the government has handled the pandemic, general kind of dislike of restrictions and lockdowns anyways. But that distrust has certainly made, I think, more people vulnerable to disinformation. Absolutely, trust in authority is crucial, but for often very legitimate reasons, people are very distrustful of authority. And I often kind of point them to other places, to doctors, to scientists, people of all varying political backgrounds and opinions who are all saying the same thing, which is when you can kind of overcome a little bit of that distrust. But absolutely, like I said at the beginning, I think cynicism, which often is a product of deep distrust in authority, institutions, government, again, for very legitimate reasons, is more crucial than people being gullible. It's often actually not people being gullible at all.
Sorry, I've just lost my place. Sorry. I've completely lost my website. I'm going mad here. A question from Anonymous asks, what drew you into this area of journalism and not other forms of investigative journalism? When I first joined the BBC, I used to do, I did shifts at Newsnight, and then I started doing some investigative
reporting investigative work looking into the impact of no-deal Brexit and the consequences particularly that would have for the health sector, for hospitals, for medical treatments and stuff like that. And then the European elections happened, and I did an investigation into Facebook groups and what was being shared in Facebook groups. And I guess as someone who's grown up with social media around me, I find it very much a natural habitat. I really love investigating what's being shared online. It feels super relevant to my life and the lives of people around me. I think that it's really, really fascinating, particularly a lot of the open source investigation as well, that I've always really admired that teams at the BBC do, or Bellingcat do, or all kinds of great things. I also studied Russian and French, and studying Russian in particular made me really fascinated by sort of influence operations and how all this stuff works. And that definitely drew me to this area. I think also as a young person, you're able to kind of offer something, I guess, that isn't age dependent. A lot of reporting jobs, particularly in the BBC, but across the entire industry, you build expertise, and some of the most brilliant reporters are people with years and years of experience in this. Whereas I think this is a whole new beat, and being able to kind of pioneer that. The BBC is the first broadcaster in the UK to have a specialist reporter who investigates disinformation in social media in that way. And it's something that has been happening in the US for a while, and I've just been totally fascinated by the topic. I'm also quite passionate at being able to humanize. I think that I'm personally very turned off by sort of reporting about tech and social media that feels really distant and sort of like unrelated and a bit geeky, as much as I do like geeky stuff as well. And I think being able to make that reporting accessible, I'm really passionate about, and showing people how it can affect real people's lives. And so I think that it's for that reason that this is a kind of this is a topic where it's really fertile ground to be able to do that. And I think that's really important.
On a couple of things. So first of all, you mentioned Bellingcat. For those of you who didn't watch the talk, we had Elliot Higgins a couple of weeks ago. Fantastic show. So please go back and check that. The mods will pop the link for YouTube in there. And back to actually the previous question about the trust in the BBC, also links back to last week's speaker of Sir David Spiegelhalter, who talked about statistics and how they can be misused. So again, check them out on YouTube. Moving on to a question from Serdar. Many conspiracy theories easily cross borders and languages. Do you collaborate with reporters and journalists from other countries?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, the BBC monitoring branch of our team is a crucial place to do that. They have a wealth of brilliant journalists and experts who speak all kinds of different languages. And most recently, they did this great research on the vaccine movement and how it's spreading online in different languages in different places. There was specific research about what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in some African countries, what's been happening in India and some South Asian countries, what's been happening in Ukraine and in Russia. And that is crucial. I think one of the things that comes up time and time again in my reporting is that social media sites are less proactively moderate conspiracy theories or harmful disinformation that is being shared in other languages, perhaps because they don't have moderators who speak those languages, or it can prove to be a huge problem. And as you rightly point out, conspiracy theories do constantly jump languages, borders. We see it happen all the time. Disinformation posts are shared in that way, and they can cause real serious harm. And similar tactics are used in different places too. So it's brilliant to collaborate sort of across the BBC, and we have an absolutely brilliant, again, languages service. And actually at the moment, I've been doing quite a lot of reporting for a new series we have called the Anti-Vax Files, which is on the World Service. And we've had loads of great stories about the impact of the anti-vax movement over the world, in Germany, in South Africa, and most recently in India, which is a really fascinating episode. You can listen to it on Sounds. And this one coming up is all about Brazil and how indigenous communities have really, really been affected by conspiracy theories. And I think the program starts with a really great anecdote about a helicopter coming to deliver vaccines, and some indigenous people shooting their bows and arrows at the helicopter because they think that the vaccine is going to harm them because of stuff they're seeing. So I definitely recommend listening to that. But it absolutely is a global problem that languages are no limit. Although when it comes to the anti-vaccine movement, the English language movement is especially strong, but that affects everyone else too.
Igor also asks, how do you manage to keep your sanity while diving in the hellish world of conspiracy theorists? How do you keep your anger level low enough to speak so calmly?
That's a very good question. I think in some ways a lot of, particularly the abuse or conspiracy theories I see, are often so outlandish you can feel quite detached from them, and that detachment is quite helpful. I absolutely love doing my job. I find it so interesting, and also I'm really passionate about it. I think it's a really important public service, and I think when you have that driving you, it sort of keeps you going. I also work with a top team. I try and switch off. I'm very, very bad at switching off, as everyone who knows me will testify, particularly my editor. But I think, yeah, being able to expose those important stories and knowing that if I do lose my temper or get annoyed or get angry about something, I won't be able to do my best reporting because I won't be able to understand. I won't be able to ask the right questions. And I found time and time again that beginning questioning or interviews from a point of understanding or empathy is much more effective at producing really impactful reporting than if I just say, I'm fan of this. And it's feedback that I get a lot from audience members that that's something that they really like. They like that kind of attempt to understand, as opposed to what is often popular nowadays, the sort of like ding dong of like back and forth, particularly on social media.
It's also the whole empathy, treating people like human beings and just trying to treat them how you'd want to be treated.
Yeah, and I think that as well, it's really interesting. Whenever I share sort of abuse I receive online, I often get loads of people saying, why do you crop out their names? You shouldn't crop out their names. They don't deserve that. They're sending you death threats. And I kind of always think, well, actually, it would be, I would not wish even the people who send me horrible death threats and nasty messages to be piled on in that way. And I think if you treat everyone that you interview and report on with that level of respect and understanding, even if you're investigating how they're doing something bad, and absolutely as part of that you need to hold people accountable, you need to ask them the difficult questions, but if you go in kind of shouting, you won't ever get anything interesting except an argument that won't be very fun.
And I hate the fact that I'm going to have to reference Marsh again, but Marsh does a podcast called Be Reasonable where he interviews people with different fringe beliefs, and I've never heard him shout on it. He doesn't shout on it because that's not the approach to take. It is about probing and about questioning and about finding out why they believe what they believe, and just having a conversation, also educating us about their beliefs, because there are some very deep fundamental things behind those beliefs that a lot of us, unless we're involved in that community, just don't understand.
And I think that understanding as well is what will kind of increase public understanding of what's going on, and that better protects people against sort of falling victim to conspiracy theories online themselves. It's just like overall a much more effective and impactful way of reporting than people just getting angry at each other and calling each other bonkers.
Yeah, absolutely. A conversation is always the way forward. It just works a lot better. We have a question from Claire. What do you think Facebook and other social media platforms should or could do to stop the spread of misinformation? And is there a reason they don't do more?
So on this point, I always have to highlight at the beginning that I'm not a campaigner or activist. So I can't sort of recommend what I think should happen. But from my experience of reporting on this topic, one thing I find time and time again is that people come to harm because social sites, it's very late on online disinformation, and a lot of critics say that social media sites could be quicker and more proactive in their moderation of content that causes both direct and indirect harm. And it's always weighing up that free speech versus, harm that could be caused question, which is one that comes up time and time again. But the general consensus, at least of most people in the UK, I think, is that harmful disinformation that causes, is a direct threat to people's lives, particularly, but also is an indirect threat to their lives, is not helpful or good. I think that there are really interesting things that a lot of experts in this field point towards. Places like Pinterest do really interesting proactive moderation, which is where you post something and then if it contains kind of particular buzzwords, it will be checked before it's shared. And that's the same on a lot of Facebook groups, except they're often being moderated by your average person who often do a brilliant job, sometimes don't do a brilliant job. And I think that those methods are all things that kind of critics point towards. But I guess my maybe not very hopeful sort of view of it is that Pandora's box is very much open, and these social media sites are huge. And I constantly am investigating the harm caused by stuff that's shared and big groups that pop up and different platforms in different places. And so I think that it's very hard to sort of put the genie back in the bottle, but there are things, I hope that my job in some ways does this, but holding social media sites and governments accountable for what they do or don't do, and reporting on the impact it causes, and also kind of the social media literacy element of what I do.
And I know from organising these talks, we've had a talk on Q, for example, on QAnon. We got a warning from Facebook because we posted an event that had the word QAnon. They didn't look at any more detail behind it. They just looked at the title and went, no, that's not good. No, take that down. And it's frustrating. And also, I think the big problem that for me from Facebook is their appeals process is not in slightest bit transparent at all, which is frustrating as organisers who are trying to put on scientifically accurate talks, but being told, no, you can't talk about that one. No, you can't talk about that. It's frustrating.
Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to them being very big point, because there is just this lack of kind of human moderation of everything, and that lack of nuance is a problem because it means stuff goes under the radar. Or a lot of online conspiracy movements like QAnon are very good at adapting, so they start using "Save Our Children" instead, and that's not picked up automatically. And vice versa for people posting good stuff that then gets labelled or taken down, and they don't understand why. And I think that's the problem, is that the number of moderators that some of these social media sites would have to hire would be very expensive and pretty large number of people.
It would. It's one of those unfortunate situations where, unfortunately, there's so much misinformation out there that they've got to do something about it. But if they hired people, they wouldn't be able to afford to hire enough people to deal with all of the misinformation on Facebook. We are going to move on to the last question, which comes from Matt Reynolds. The question is, when you signed up for one thing and then a pandemic happened, did you have second thoughts as your remit and workload ballooned?
I really like this question, Matt. I have to say, I don't think I really was able to have any second thoughts. It definitely was more than I bargained for, but in many ways very positive. I've been able to do so much reporting sort of across TV, radio and online, and for everyone. And I think investigate really crucial stories that I hope have had a big impact and been a positive force and good thing for the world. And if I'd given up, I wouldn't be able to do that. So I'm very happy that I am. If I'd given up, I wouldn't even be sitting here talking to you. So always worth persevering. Make hay while the sun shines. Although that was maybe slightly inappropriate. Slightly inappropriate thing to say, but anyway.
So thank you so much for coming to join us. Absolutely fascinating talk. Brilliant Q&A. It's been great. If you want to follow Marianna on Twitter, she is at Marianna Spring. I hope you can join us next week for Alex Vitale's talk, and that you can join us in the Lock-In's Razor online Zoom pub, which will be opening up in a few minutes. I'd like to say a big thanks to our techs this evening, which were David and Matty, and our backup host and Slido moderator was Gerald. So thank you to those, and thank you to all of you for coming along, and hopefully we'll see you in the virtual pub or next week. Have a good night.